Hi, everybody. Welcome to the final episode of Season 1 of Wine Time with AARP Missouri. Dave, we sure have been on a great journey over the past few weeks, haven't we?
Absolutely. It's been a lot of fun. And thanks to everybody who's joined in, tuned in throughout the whole series and parts of it. But in the comments below, if you learned anything or put just what you've enjoyed about this whole thing, this getting together and every Tuesday night and talking about wine and the wine business and different parts of the world where wine's grown. So just let us know if you've enjoyed it or if there's anything that really stuck out to you. That'll be fun. But of course, we have our final episode with our special guest, Bart Hansen, tonight. But first, let's remind everyone of the wine and food pairing magnet that they can get by entering to win and that amazing wine tote.
That's right. So tonight is your last chance to register for your magnet. So as soon as you register, you will automatically be entered into the sweepstakes to win the fabulous wine tote. So everybody, Dave and I are so excited. I know you keep hearing us talk about it, but it really is a pretty cool bag, a backpack or a little handle pack, but it's got lots of room. So again, register tonight. And tomorrow, our winners will be announced. So don't delay. So now that I have actually shared some of that information with you, I'm going to duck out for just a little bit so Dave can have some time with our special guest, Bart Hansen, out of Dane Cellars. So I'll be back soon. So take it away, Dave.
Hey, Bart. Thanks for coming on today.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
Doing very well. So everybody, this is Bart Hansen. He's been in the wine business 30 plus years, I guess. That sounds about right.
Yeah, this harvest is harvest number 35 for me.
Wow, fantastic. So also, so he makes his winery is Dane Cellars, and he's co-host also of the world famous #9 wine podcast in the world, the Winemakers podcast. And on top of that, his wine is amazing. So thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I've had a little bit already, just making sure everything was still good with it, Bart. So.
I opened them. I wanted to make sure quality control was good myself.
Absolutely. So just a little bit about what we've been doing on this show, Bart, so you kind of know where we're coming from and what the folks have kind of experienced so far that are watching. We've talked about a lot of different wines and wine styles. We did rosé first because that's important. White, red, sparkling. We just did our sweet and dessert wine episode last week. We talked about wines from all over the world: France, California, Spain, New Zealand, Portugal, careers in the wine industry. The first one we talked about was the winemaker and how to be, different ways you might get into that side of things. You may try to talk someone out of doing that. I'm not sure, but we talked about, lab workers. My wife is a scientist, so I think her dream is always work in a lab for where they make wine. And then people who make the barrels, and then just how wine, and how to work in the service industry and how knowledge about wine can help with that. So we learned how to taste wine. I taught him my process of the 6 S's, which is see, swirl, sniff, sip, swish, and savor. Whether you spit or swallow, it's savor. You're savoring it. So that's what we do. So, and then we did talk about a few things about wine and your health, and we debunked some myths about wine. So enough about us. So tell us about how you got into the wine industry.
Well, so my first harvest was 1986. I was 20 years old. And I had no idea about the wine industry as being, an opportunity for a job. It wasn't nearly as big as it is now, but like literally my mom said, wouldn't it be fun to work at a winery? So I went over to Sonoma. I was living in Petaluma and just started knocking on doors. And I happened to meet Mike Lee, who was the owner of Kenwood Winery. Mm-hmm. And they were hiring for harvest. So that's the first way. If you want to get into production, you don't go looking for a job in the middle of the winter. You go just before harvest, July, August, when everybody's looking for people with strong backs and uncalloused hands. And I picked up a harvest job, and the main thing I did that year was just haul grapes from the vineyard to the winery. It was back and forth. Get there, help load the grapes, drive them to the winery safely, and that was important, safely, and then unload them and head back.
Nice.
And then from there, It was supposed to be a seasonal job. And from there, they asked me to stay on and work in the warehouse. And I got to learn about running the bottling line. And for about 2.5 years, I helped run the bottling line and helped manage the warehouse. And then again, during harvest, helping out in the vineyard more than anything else. And because of my expertise driving the forklift, one day someone said, "Do you want to learn how to move barrels around?" And that was, once I got my foot in the cellar and, kind of saw what was going on there, it opened up a whole nother world. Like, I really didn't have the grasp, even though I was making some homemade wine that first year, I didn't have the grasp of what it really took until then. And then I was hooked. Then it was just a matter of, when could I actually make a wine myself for the company. Perfect. So, and that took a while.
Yeah. Well, I think the key takeaway from that is, if you really want to learn how to make wine, learn to drive a forklift first.
It is. And it's interesting because when you have young interns or harvest help come in, everybody kind of gravitates towards the forklift because it's a pretty cool machine. And I have mine right back there, my Model 1.
Nice.
And it seems like it's a good job. It seems like it's an easy job. You don't have to use your back. You just kind of use your hands. But there's a lot of pressure that goes on when driving the forklift when you're lifting up 6 barrels of wine that, each one of them weighs about 1,000 pounds.
Right.
And I've dropped a lot of barrels in my career. So it's not pretty.
Yeah.
But that was really where I started really appreciating it. And then, as you were saying about like opportunities in the wine business, the wine business has expanded so much. There's so many more opportunities, just in that there's so many more businesses that supply equipment to wineries, and so many more cork companies and label companies, and now alternative packaging. So really, it just keeps becoming more and more opportunity for it in the beverage industry in general. I mean,
right.
Micro distillers and fine quality distilling has become big, and of course everybody knows the beer industry. Lots of opportunities there.
Yep, definitely. So after Kenwood, you went to Benziger, is that correct?
I did. I got an opportunity. Kenwood had sold to Corbel, and it was apparent that there was going to be a lot of change, and I got an opportunity to stay with another small family business, the Benzigers, and I was the assistant winemaker. I worked for both Joe and Mike Benziger, and on each of their projects. And it was really cool because we had just started farming organically and biodynamically. When I was at Kenwood, we had some vineyards of organic grapes that we farmed. And the whole thing about biodynamics was a fascinating kind of change into a whole nother sort of agriculture. For those of you who don't know what biodynamic farming is, it's the highest form. Well, it used to be the highest form of organic farming, and it took into account as your property being a single entity, that you don't bring in anything. So if you need compost, you produce your own compost and you have your own cows. And if you need eggs for egg white finding, you have chickens on the farm and you use those eggs. And now it's gone beyond that. Now it's what they call regenerative farming. And that's something that I think is really important, because that's not what you don't do at the property, but it's everything you put back into the property to be a better farmer, which just helps with the whole world.
Yep.
So I was with the Benzigers for 10 years. And then in 2007, my wife and I, we had our son Dane was born, and I got the chance to be a stay-at-home dad. My wife works in San Francisco and leaves very, very early in the morning. She works New York hours. And so I got to be a stay-at-home dad. And that didn't last for that long, actually. We started Dane Cellars in 2007 with some inspiration, for him as naming the winery after him. And I knew which wines I wanted to make. And then there was a small winery starting in Sonoma called Lassiter Family Winery, owned by John and Nancy Lassiter. John was one of the creators of Pixar. And they were very small, and they needed someone to actually do the work. I was the assistant winemaker was my title. I was the day-to-day winemaker. There was a consultant who kind of had the style of where we were going, but it was just her and I. And so I made all those wines myself. It was a little bit of a step back in that for me, because at Bensger I'd kind of gotten to be more of a supervisor.
Sure.
Certainly tasting wine and dealing with wines every day, but I had a crew. And now it's back to doing all the work myself, which was really rewarding. And it also really helped me hone my own skills for my own wines. Because that's the thing with my wines, is that I'm the only person that touches them. And so it keeps it very very easy to keep track of everything.
Yeah.
You know?
And if anybody
and quality, of course, number one. Sorry.
Sure. And if anybody's interested in how hands-on Bart is, follow him on Instagram, and he sets his phone up in the winery while he's doing punch downs and everything else. So it's really cool to kind of catch up with him and follow the wines that we'll be drinking in our glass eventually. So that's good. So
thanks, Dave. You know, and just something on that, and you know, for those of you who you know, maybe not traveling, but when you come out and visit, September, October is really a great time to come visit the wine country. There's nothing like being able to get people that come out and actually see the grapes in the vineyard and see them in the winery and understand how this transformation from a raw product to a beautiful glass of wine happens, to really make you appreciate the wine. So
awesome. Yeah, definitely. I have not been up during harvest, but that I hope to do that eventually. So we actually have a couple of your wines here. So the first one we're going to taste is the 2016 Gopher Run Zinfandel, is what I have. I don't know what you opened up there. But
I opened the same thing.
Yeah. Awesome. So tell us a little bit about the wine, and we're going to see, swirl, sniff, sip, swish, and savor, all that good stuff. So while we're going on, but tell us about the history of it, you know, the vineyard it comes from, and then we'll talk about the final product too, obviously.
Yeah.
You talk.
So this vineyard's located on the southwest side of Sonoma Valley. It sits right at the base of Sonoma Mountain. A new vineyard for me, but I'm very familiar with the area. I've worked with other vineyards in my previous jobs all around that area, and it's a really unique specific spot because of all the rocks. There's a large creek bed there called Calabasas Creek that goes through, and you know, boulders about, you know, the size of a football typically, and the whole area is just all over the place. You don't actually put a shovel in the ground and dig dirt there. You take a pick and you pull the rocks out of the ground, and what dirt's left behind is your planting material. So it makes for a very unique wine. The vines have to struggle a lot, which is beneficial for Zinfandel, because Zinfandel wants to grow so profusely. You know, it wants to have very large berries, and by stressing the vines, you get smaller berries with more intense flavors. The vineyard sits up on a bench. It's a younger vineyard, but very healthy. They've just recently stopped using irrigation on it. They're going to try to dry farm it. That, of course, will be dependent on our weather patterns over the next few years. But they did put in the irrigation lines. Again, like I said, it's all rock, so you need to give the vines to get established. But once established, they should be able to get down and find their own water. This vineyard is 95% Zinfandel, and then it has 2.5% Petit Syrah and 2.5% Alicante Bouschet. So it's done in a way that it's a true field blend. So we don't pick those things separately. You walk through the vineyard and you notice that every 7th or 8th vine, there's one that has a different leaf, or maybe the bunches are different, or, you know, Petit Syrah tends to be very late. So it might still be green when everything else is red and whatnot. And that just adds to the uniqueness of this wine. Yeah. Both 2016 and 2017 were very warm years. And I think you'd see that in this wine. There's a certain amount of intensity in it. It's a big, robust wine. especially when it's first open and the cork pulled. With some time in the glass, you see that some of the aromatics start to come out a little bit more. It may appear to be a little closed. The aromatics come out really well, and then the fruit and tasting it, it again also starts to open up and change from more black fruit to more red fruit. Pretty good tannin profile. It's not drying or anything. It's rich. And you can tell, I mean, it is a slightly higher alcohol wine. That goes along with the fact in 2016 it was warm and we got ripe really quick. But I think it's balanced, and especially with some food. This wine is definitely a food-friendly wine. And I also think this wine's going to age out really well. I typically have like a couple bottles of it sitting around on the counter, opening on different days. So there are different levels, because for me, that's a way to tell like how a wine is going to age out, you know? Mm-hmm. We like to think that you guys all open a bottle of wine and drink at least 1 or 2 bottles a night. But typically there is a partial bottle that lays on the counter. And I think in the old days, people used to think that if they didn't drink it, it wasn't good anymore. But really what you should be looking at that is how is the wine aging? Like the next day, mm-hmm. Does it taste better? And then maybe the day after that, it still tastes good. And what that says is if you have a few bottles that have been in your cellar, then you don't need to be in a hurry to drink them.
Right. Absolutely. Or maybe you should drink them and then buy more.
Well, the consummate wine salesman, Dave. That's very good. Thank you. We appreciate that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And you know, the other thing about Zinfandel is you know, I think a lot of people feel that Zinfandel is a big hearty wine, which it is. But Zinfandel by itself, it can be very delicate. And I have another Zin that I make called Lo Chamazol, which is 100% Zin. And if we were to try them next to each other, you would see the likeness of the varieties, but the impact that the Alicante and the Petit Syrah put into it.
Yeah. Zin is one of my first loves in wine, actually, back in the mid 90s. Of course, you know what Zins were like back in the late 90s, I guess, but right. they were all crazy then. But the delicacy that you have in a lot of yours, even in the bigger ones, the ease that they have is going with food and that type of thing is pretty amazing. And I love your Zinfandels. So
thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that goes along with my wines, and you see this reflected in the wine, is that how they change once the cork has been opened and the evolution. And a lot of that has to go with the lack of manipulation that I do on the wines. You know, we just use spontaneous yeast for the fermentation, whatever is, you know, floating around, comes in from the vineyard or floating around in the cellar. We don't filter any of our wines. Any of our red wines are not filtered. We don't fine them. And then we don't move them a lot. We don't take them out of the barrels and put them back in the barrels unless we really feel it's necessary. And what that does is that keeps the wines young and hopefully fresh and full of fruit. And by not moving them when they're young, it really helps them into age out.
Sure. And
I have some older Zins that I'm sending out to some people. Dave, you're going to be part of that tasting. And mm-hmm. I was really excited when I opened up the 2010, and even though it has this aged wine character, it was amazing how alive it still was and how really interesting it was. So I'm anxious to try it with you guys.
Yeah, I'm excited about that one too. That's because I don't usually keep wines around that long. So
no, neither do I.
Good deal. So you've kind of talked a little bit about kind of your philosophy of making wine and that kind of stuff. So and that kind of is across the board, not just with your Zinfandels, but the your whole line of wines is pretty much hands off and that kind of stuff. So any other, like, how do you choose which you mentioned when you started the winery in 2007, you mentioned that you knew what wines you wanted to make. So what kind of do you look for when you're doing that, when you're deciding which ones to make?
So I knew that I wanted to concentrate in Sonoma Valley. So trying to, you know, Sonoma County is a huge county.
Right.
And for me, especially with having my number one responsibility was taking care of Dane, I wasn't going to be able to go up to Dry Creek and walk around vineyards and Alexander Valley and for that matter, the Sierra foothills. As appealing as it is, there's vineyards in all those places I'd love to work with. But I knew Sonoma Valley. I'd worked here for over 20 years at the time. I knew growers who I really liked. I knew they were good growers. I really wanted to concentrate on organically grown grapes, and I had places to find that here. Zinfandel was my first love in wine. And then I knew that eventually I wanted to work with some of the Rhone varieties. There weren't a lot of them planted here in Sonoma Valley at the time, unless they were winery owned. So that was a little bit slower to get to that part. We had to make Cab because Cab is king.
Right.
And then Chenin Blanc. And so as of right now, the one white wine I've made is Chenin Blanc, and that's a great variety that really doesn't get the respect it deserves. And so that's the one wine that we make.
You make Chenin Blanc?
Yeah. You have to listen to the podcast, folks, and then you'll understand that. But so there's no Chenin Blanc planted in this valley at this point, or at least none that I could buy at the time. There is a small vineyard owned now by a gentleman by the name of Eric Bradley, but he keeps it all for himself. So I was able to find a vineyard up in Mendocino County, about an hour and a half north of here, owned by the City of 10,000 Buddhas teaching colony. It's a Buddhist colony up there. And they had this old vineyard that had some mixed reds on it and some Barbera and all these old vines that were planted back in the 40s, and then a block of Chenin Blanc. And so there's 4 of us that share the vineyard, organically farmed, almost organic by neglect. Unfortunately, they don't have a whole lot of budget. There's not really an emphasis to try to really farm the property, but it makes just such good wine. The 4 winemakers have all just said, you know what, we're not going to ask much of them because we want them to keep it in. If they ever decide, you know what, we're not making any money on it, let's just pull it out, or we're not making enough money on it, let's just pull it out. And we want to preserve the vines. I mean, there's nothing like that in the North Coast. Sure. There's some foothills where you can find some Chenin and a little bit of Napa that's close to that age. But yeah, 1943, I believe it was planted.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's an amazing Chenin Blanc too. I love
Thank
it.
you. Thanks.
Yeah.
It really is a versatile variety, in the Loire Valley. As you know, they make it anywhere from sparkling wine up to dessert wines. Unfortunately, in California, when Chardonnay became so popular, Chardonnay was easier to farm. You could get a higher crop load. They were paying more for it at the time because it was hot, and Chenin just got pulled out acre by acre by acre.
Now, your Chenin got some fame last fall, right? If I remember correctly.
And you know what? And we're coming back to Thanksgiving, and I guess I got to go with it again. Yeah. Our Chenin Blanc was picked by Oprah magazine as being one of the 10 most perfect wines for Thanksgiving.
Well, I heard Oprah picked it herself. I'm not sure. That's the story that I got from it.
I can say that Oprah did receive some of it.
Nice.
So yeah. No, and you know what? That was a really cool thing to be acknowledged by, and it certainly sold a bunch of wine. Yeah, and it's great for Chenin Blanc. Let's face it. Absolutely.
So, hey, real quick change of scenery here a little bit. How did your logo come about? I think I don't know if I'll be able to get my camera to focus on it, but
maybe I can.
It's a great look, yeah.
So first of all, the first artist we worked with, he was a friend of a friend, and he said, I think I see a big dog. And we were like, I don't think that's not it. We're not going for a critter label. And so Terry, my wife Terry, and I, we both knew that we wanted some sort of of a mark on it, some sort of a logo. We knew we wanted to keep it a kind of traditionally based label. Anyone who drinks wine goes to the wine shop now, you walk through and you have a hard time figuring out what the wine is. I mean, they're beautiful labels, but you don't know who the winery is or the variety or anything. So we wanted to stick with something a little more traditional. Terry actually came up with the idea of the D and the C. When Dane was young, he loved to go out. That lizard is not a gecko. It's what we call a California fence lizard. People know him as a blue belly lizard. And so when Dane was real young, and our dogs still do, they chase the lizards all over the yard. And whenever you would grab one of those lizards and you pick it up, it curls like that. If you get it by the tail breaks off and they scurry away.
Right.
But if you get them in the body, they curl kind of like the C.
Cool.
And Terry came up with the idea of using the lizard as the C, and then the D that kind of reflects, if you look at it close, the rock in the area.
Yeah, cool.
So that's where that came from.
Good deal. Now, I've had some folks ask, and I thought you'd be a good person to address this. So your wines typically $35 to $45, $50 a bottle. So that kind of brought up an opportunity to talk about. So let's talk about what the difference between maybe a small production $35 bottle versus a $10 bottle of Zinfandel that I can buy at the grocery store. Talk about some of what makes that difference, and here's your chance to tell everybody why it's worth it.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing you have to look at here is, where do the grapes come from? And if the appellation on the bottle of wine is California, that means that most likely the grapes come from very, very large industrialized farming ranches all throughout California. It's not to say they're not from Sonoma County. Well, it does say, because if it was all from Sonoma County, it would say Sonoma County. Right. But it could be some from Sonoma County, it could be some from Monterey, Fresno, anywhere. And what that means is that they have very large mechanicalized farming products. They're using, herbicides. They're using pesticides. And don't get me wrong, in the wine business, we use very little of any sort of pesticides at all. But it's just large farming. It's large contract farming, corporate farming. An example, you can buy Chenin Blanc in the Central Valley for about $600 a ton. And for this vineyard that we get these grapes from, it's about $2,800 a ton. Wow. So that can give you an idea right there, starting off just the cost of the grapes. And then people, to go on to that same conversation, so why are there even more expensive wines in Napa Valley? Cabernets, why are they so expensive? It all starts with how much the grapes are costing and what it costs to farm those grapes. It costs more to farm hillside vineyards, like the Desnudo's cab that we're going to try next. And a lot more passes for quality wine production. People have to go through and touch the grapes more often. You have to go through and remove the berries that might be sunburned or might be green still because they're falling behind. You're doing more to position the grapes so they're not laying on top of each other, where places where you could have mold and mildew might start growing. In a lot of those large production ranching, they don't do that, one, because there's no money for it, and two, they just don't have the manpower to do it. And so what you start off with is lesser quality grapes. And as we say, you can't make great wine from mediocre grapes.
But
you have to start
and make mediocre wine from really good grapes.
You certainly can, and I hate to say it happens a lot, but it does happen a lot.
Sure.
And then it goes into all the way through to production. Smaller wineries like myself, you might be making wine at a custom crush place where there's 10 or 11 small wineries all making wine at one facility. And that's added cost also, because they have employees, because in situations like that, you couldn't have someone like me just running around doing whatever I want. You need people that work for the company, one, to keep it safe and to keep it orderly and whatnot.
Yep.
And then, you're buying less bottles, you're buying less corks, you're buying less labels, and so the economy of scale
Right.
is skewed there. So that's the reason why.
Yep. I think
And the other thing is, we work really, really hard at it.
that's right. That's right. That's something, as somebody who sells wine every day, and that's a question that I get asked a lot. So, and then it came up as I told him I was going to be talking to a real living, breathing winemaker. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to bring that up. So let's get into this cab before we.
So Desnudo's cab is located on the other side of the valley from the Zinfandel vineyard, at the base of it's not even at the base of the Mayacamas range. It's at the southern base of the Mayacamas range, kind of down like where Gunlock Bundschu or where Buena Vista Winery is, for any of your listeners. So a little cooler area, cool climate Cabernet. Definitely gets a marine influence because it looks straight out at the bay. You can see San Francisco from this vineyard, and it's about 800 foot of elevation. So not like farther up the valley where it's much warmer, where the days are longer, where it's exposed to the sun. The other thing is it's south east facing. So this vineyard is shielded from the hot afternoon sun, ripening, making it ripen quicker. So this is a very slow ripening vineyard also. A very kind of unique spot for Cabernet. Desnudo's vineyard is named that way because back in the 40s, there was a nudist colony up there. And the reason why anyone even knows about it is because there was a sheriffs were called to the property one day because not because people were running around naked at this ranch that had a bar and a pond and a swimming pool and had little cabins you could rent, but it's because people were using their gas rations to get there.
Right.
And then they were also illegal vacation rentals also. So, but the cabins, the cabins still existed when we were buying the grapes from this. Some of them were destroyed in the 2017 fire, which was real sad. But a beautiful piece of property, sits on the side of a hill. Like I said, 800 foot of elevation. These grapes weren't picked till the end of October. On a warm year that maybe they would have been picked sooner had it not been in this unique growing spot, and having the influence of the fog coming in from the bay all the time.
Yeah.
Again, the winemaking was, the wine grapes were destemmed, put into a tank. We kept them in the tank for about 3 days, very, very cold, trying to just extract flavor and flavor and aromatics out of the grapes before the fermentation started. And then I turned off the cooling and the wine started to warm up to, just the air temperature. And then usually about then the fermentation just starts on its own. I started doing the hand punch downs, and I thought someone asked what a punch down is. And so maybe we'll back up and go, and I'm sure you talked about this a little bit about how wine is made. But if I could touch base on it real quick, the red grapes come in, we destem them, we put them into a tank, do our cold soak. And then when the fermentation starts, you get 3 things during fermentation. You get energy in the form of temperature. Temperature goes up. You get CO2 production, which is off gases from the yeast. And then you get the conversion of sugar to alcohol. And so when it starts to ferment and starts pushing up the CO2, it pushes all the skins to the top of the tank. And red wine juice or red grape juice is typically clear, if not slightly pink, when it's first destemmed. And so where the color comes from is from the skins of those grapes. So in the case of this, there's 2 or 3 ways to do this. You can either punch down, which means I use a large paddle or a large flat paddle and has a pole on it, and you literally push the grapes down into the juice several times, submerging it, allowing it to freshen through the grapes. or you can use a device and a pump, and you can use a hose and just like irrigate the grapes. And either way, that helps bring out those flavors. It brings out the intensity and the color from the fruit. So that's what a punch down is, when you're punching it down. We do it 2 or 3 times a day. It also helps regulate the temperature, allowing the fruit not to get too hot, because red wine fermentation can get well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit if left unchecked. And at that point, you start killing yeast, and then you start losing your fermentation.
Sure.
And that's where you go on to that thing where you have really beautiful grapes and you make bad wine out of it. That's one of those things. So
right.
That's why we spend so much time at the winery during harvest monitoring things. So.
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful wine. This is fantastic.
Thank you. I guess I just saw someone asked about the fires. We are safe from the fires. It's been a crazy year. We actually had what we're calling like 3 different fire incidents here in the area. The last one, which one was the closest, was it got us about as close as 15 miles from where we live. But it got within about 1.5 miles of a couple of our vineyards. And unfortunately, there are going to be vineyards this year that we're not going to be able to harvest the grapes. The grapes become filled with the smoke and chemically bonds to the grapes, and it can come out in the fermentation. So I do have some grapes that were harvested before the smoke impact really hit. I'm very, very hopeful that they're going to make some nice wine. If not, I have good relationships with the growers, and we're going to figure it out. But yeah, we're safe, and we actually had some blue skies yesterday, and
that's got to be a relief to finally see that.
Yeah. So, but we do have friends and colleagues that have had a very rough year this year.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. I keep getting emails from wineries that I follow, and just hearing people say that they're not making a 2020 vintage of reds, or they're not making 2020 at all. And of course, there's the half dozen or dozen that have the wineries lost properties and vineyards are gone. And so it's been just terrible to watch from afar. And I can't imagine being out there in the center of it all. So
yeah, and I can tell you, I mean, and not a place to get into these debates of climate change and whatnot, but I grew up in Sonoma County. And we've seen our weather patterns change over the past, 40 years or so, I'll say, because I would say I wasn't paying attention to it until I was like 15. But, we used to have a lot more fog, and we would have days in the hundreds, but we wouldn't have weeks in the hundreds. And we didn't have these these wind events that we're having and stuff. So, there's definitely stuff going on, and
something's happening.
And it's going to change. It's going to change the wine industry. It really is. It already has.
Yeah.
So,
the wine industry. And then, like you talked about, the number of how big it is now and how many people work attached to that industry in one way or another. And then you throw in the hospitality and tourism industry that builds off of that out there. And it's just been, I can't imagine.
I do have to say that, people, there are people coming to visit, and it's nice to see people. It's a little odd, people are good wearing their mask and stuff. But you can tell people want to come and they want to support, and we really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So
that's why I tell people when they come in to see me at work, what's going on and what needs to happen. And like, you need to buy wine from Napa and Sonoma. And if you can find a small producer to buy it from, they're hurting as bad as the big guys are. So let's see if we can do that. So
yeah, and it's a really something that's coming out of this is really interesting for people that are really into wine, is that there are wineries that had a large amount of their product that they sold through the restaurants, and with COVID and everything going on, there's a lot of wines that were never really made available to the general public, maybe even like some of your stores would never see, that are showing up in stores and stuff, and that wines that you couldn't necessarily buy from the winery are available, or maybe there would be a small amount available through the winery, and now they're available. So if you have those wines that you love that are hard to find, and you can't find them in a store or a restaurant, don't be afraid to contact your local wine or the winery and see what they got.
Definitely. So let's talk about the podcast. How did that come about? Was it 3 or 4 years you guys have been doing this now?
Yeah, I think we did 163 episodes. Today was 164, I think.
Wow.
So John Myers is a local character. John had a radio show on KSVN, and he would have myself on. It was a wine podcast. I mean, a wine radio show,
Cool.
just talking about local wineries and stuff. And he had myself on, and then he had Sam Coturri. Sam's dad is Phil Coturri. They have a winery called Winery 16600. It's actually it's his parents' address. They live on 1600 Norbaum Road, and we used to joke that way Phil knew how to get home.
Right.
Just point to the label. And then Brian Casey, who's a local sommelier here, and was the wine buyer for The Girl and the Fig, and is now at the Somm at the Fairmont. And he would have us all on periodically, either together or alone. And John had a friend, or has a friend in Chicago. Shout out to the Podfather, Ed. And Ed has the Radio Misfits podcast station. And he, pitched it to him to host our show. And so John just kind of came up with it. We figured we're a consumer, a grape grower, a winemaker, and a somm. And so we have some all different interesting perspectives.
Yep.
And we all know a bunch of people. And so we just started kind of having people on. And we've had some amazing shows, things like Richard Arrowwood, who was the winemaker for Chateau St. Jean forever and had his own label, Arrowwood. And in one of the stories, we had him telling a story about cruising downtown Santa Rosa when he was 18 years old. And, his uncle was the sheriff and telling him to go home at 2:00 in the morning. And if you ever met Richard, he'd never tell you this story. I mean, it would never come up. And,
right.
We've had Randall Graham from Bonnie Doon on. And then probably the greatest thing about it is having little small wineries like our friend Danny Fay, who has Hill Atara, or Craig Fitzpatrick, who has Ocean Tides. And just small, and like for myself, small wineries that people would never hear about unless someone told them about it.
And from Missouri, you had Chris Leonard from
and Chris Leonard.
Yep.
And so it's really been awesome, sharing their stories. And then we joke that they get the winemaker bump. And there's nothing better, to be honest, is that you see on Instagram or on Facebook, you see somebody posting a picture of somebody's wine saying, we found out about it from the Winemakers podcast.
Yep.
It's really a community-based thing. And so it's been really good. And so you can find it if you just search for The Winemakers, 3 different words. We're on all the platforms, Apple, Spotify. I guess I should know them all, but if you search for it, it's there.
There's more of them than any of us could remember, I think. Different places to look through those now. But yeah, those are the primary.
And it's been really good. We're also trying to capture some history. We have some podcast planning coming up this spring. Getting some of the people that were the people that I learned from growing up, and trying to nail down some of the history in Sonoma and Napa. I have plans for a gentleman who I know who has a small label in Napa, and he actually was hired by Robert Mondavi when he was like 17 years old, and is in his early 60s now, and worked with Mondavi during the heyday. And so there's some history there, and it's a way to capture it.
Yeah, you've had Joel Peterson talking about. There's not a lot more
talking about history
than that one. Yeah.
Yeah. The fun thing is having Joel Peterson on, and then having his son Morgan on, and having them each tell the same story, and their different perspective from those 2 stories.
Exactly. Well, we could talk about wine all night, I think, Bart, but
we could.
We probably should let the AARP folks go. So,
okay.
Well, let's let everybody know. So the best way to get a hold of you and your wines is at danecellars.com.
Yep, it is.
You're on Instagram at Dane_Cellars.
Correct.
And at
And
Facebook
then
and Twitter at Dane Cellars.
That's correct. Yeah. Somehow that underscore on Instagram happened, but it is what it is at this point. Follow along. I've tried to become pretty interactive this year during harvest. We still have some stuff to do. Got some bins to press out in the next week here, and I'll be documenting that. Cool. And then we have a bottling coming up in November. The podcast
this year. Did I see your?
We're making a small amount of rosé this year that I'm very excited about. It's more of an experimental lot that the grower and I were doing together, and we'll see how it turns out. And then we have some Malbec that we got in before the smoke this year, which is a new thing for us. Mm-hmm. And then another new source for Zinfandel that I was able to get. It's from the Abbott's Passage property, which is Katie Bunchu of the family from Gunlock Bunchu, her brand. And what that is, that's the old Valley of the Moon property. So Valley of the Moon winery established, I think, in the 30s by the Parducci family. The original property was part of the old Hooker estate going back to the mid 1800s.
Wow.
The Zin that I'm getting from was amazingly planted also in the 40s. And I actually got to work with the fruit when I worked at Kenwood because we got some of the fruit during that time. So now to be able to make the wine myself, I'm very excited about it.
Man, you've been around. That sounds like something that Joel Peterson would say. Oh, I worked with this fruit years ago.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because I heard a rumor there's a Zin vineyard that was one of the very first vineyards I ever went into. And they've been selling to a large corporate brand that will remain unnamed. And they didn't want the grapes this year. And I'm thinking, oh, well, next year.
Right. Yeah, there you go.
I'm right here if they don't want them. So we'll see how that goes.
Awesome.
But yeah, if anyone's coming out to Sonoma, we don't have a tasting room. But I do. I have my winery is shared with 2 other winemakers in a business park, and we'd be happy to host you down there, show you some barrels, taste a little bit of wine, and anybody who might want to try some wines, I do have a discount code. If you go to DaneCellars.com, it's SIPSV, so SIP Sonoma Valley. And get you a little discount if you want to try some of the wines.
Cool. That's awesome. Well, Bart, thank you again for taking time. I know harvest is a busy time for you and for you to be able to make and everything else that's crazy out there. So I really appreciate you coming on with us this afternoon.
Oh, we really appreciate being part of it. Are you kidding me? Anytime I get to, a free chance to talk about my wines and taste a little bit of wine, it's worth it. So cool. Thank you, Dave. Awesome. Really appreciate it.
Cheers.
Cheers.
I think they're going to swap you out and Amber will suddenly magically reappear. Hey, Amber.
Hi, Dave. That was amazing. So Bart has such a interesting history. I could listen to him go on and on. So some really great stories for sure. So, but we definitely need to wrap up our episode. So I just want to say thank you to you, Dave. You have been such a joy to work with and provided so much knowledge and information. And you definitely have a passion. So we definitely appreciate that. So again, just real quickly, register for your magnet, and we won't say goodbye, Dave. We will just say until next time, okay? Until next time. So cheers.
Cheers.